Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. His birth marked the beginning of what would become one of America's most notorious criminal sagas. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was just 22 years old and unmarried, a situation that brought deep shame to her deeply religious family in the conservative society of the 1940s. The identity of Ted's biological father remains one of the enduring mysteries surrounding the case. His birth certificate originally listed his father as unknown, though various theories have emerged over the decades. Some sources suggest Lloyd Marshall, an Air Force veteran and Penn State graduate, while others point to Jack Worthington. The most disturbing theory, suggested by some family members, was that Ted's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, might have been his biological father through incest, though DNA testing in 2020 reportedly disproved this claim. To hide the shame of illegitimate birth, the Cowell family devised an elaborate deception that would profoundly impact Ted's psychological development. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted lived in Philadelphia with his maternal grandparents, Samuel Connect Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet. He was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother Louise was actually his older sister. This fundamental lie about his identity would later be cited by psychologists as a crucial factor in his psychological formation. The early signs of Ted's disturbing nature manifested remarkably young. At age 3, his aunt recounted a chilling incident where she awoke from a nap to find young Ted standing by her bed, smiling, with kitchen knives arranged around her sleeping form. This early fascination with weapons and potential violence would prove to be an ominous harbinger of what was to come. In 1950, Louise moved with 4-year-old Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where they lived with her Uncle Jack, a music professor at the College of Puget Sound. The following year, Louise married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook and Army veteran who would adopt Ted and give him his surname. Despite this stable family arrangement, Ted reportedly felt little respect for his stepfather, whom he considered beneath him due to Johnny's working-class background and limited education. The Bundy household expanded with the addition of 4 more children, but Ted remained emotionally distant from his new family. His childhood neighbor, Sandy Holt, later described him as someone who liked to terrify people and liked to be in charge, characterizing him as a bully who derived pleasure from causing fear, suffering, and pain. As Ted grew older, more troubling behaviors emerged. During his teenage years, he began exhibiting voyeuristic tendencies, peering into windows and stealing items that caught his interest. Fellow students and neighbors noted his ability to lie convincingly and his complete lack of remorse when caught in wrongdoing. Despite these red flags, Ted managed to maintain a facade of normalcy that would serve him well in his later criminal career. The revelation of his true parentage came during his late teens or early 20s, though accounts vary about exactly when and how he discovered the truth. Some sources suggest a cousin revealed it by showing him his birth certificate, while others indicate he discovered it himself. Regardless of the method, this discovery reportedly filled Ted with lifelong resentment toward his mother for the deception and for never telling him about his real father. Ted's academic performance in high school was adequate but unremarkable. He was described as shy and introverted, struggling to connect with his peers despite his intelligence. These social difficulties would later fuel his need for control and manipulation that characterized his adult relationships and criminal behavior. The psychological foundation for Ted's future crimes was being laid during these formative years. The combination of identity confusion, early exposure to violence through his disturbing behaviors, lack of stable male role models, and the fundamental deception about his origins created a perfect storm for the development of antisocial personality traits. Mental health experts who later studied his case would point to this period as crucial in understanding how a seemingly normal child could develop into one of America's most prolific serial killers. Ted Bundy's college years marked a crucial transformation period that would shape both his public persona and his private descent into violence. In 1966, at age 19, he enrolled at the University of Puget Sound but soon transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle. Initially unfocused academically, Ted struggled with his identity and future direction, changing majors from Chinese to urban planning before finally settling on psychology. During the spring of 1967, Ted met Stephanie Brooks, a pseudonym used to protect her identity. a wealthy, sophisticated student from California who embodied everything Ted aspired to possess: money, class, and social status. Brooks represented the life of privilege that Ted desperately wanted, but had never known. Their relationship became intense, with Ted completely infatuated by her elegance and social connections. However, the relationship was doomed by Ted's immaturity and lack of direction. In the fall of 1968, Brooks grew tired of Ted's aimless attitude and ended their relationship, later telling friends that she couldn't see a future with someone who lacked ambition and clear goals. This rejection devastated Ted and would become a pivotal moment in his psychological development. Many experts later theorized that his subsequent victims, predominantly attractive young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle, bore a striking resemblance to Stephanie Brooks. The breakup sent Ted into a psychological tailspin. He dropped out of the University of Washington and drifted aimlessly for several months, working various menial jobs and struggling with depression. In early 1969, he made a journey to Burlington, Vermont, to research his origins, finally confirming the truth about his illegitimate birth and the identity deception that had defined his early years. This discovery only deepened his resentment and sense of abandonment. Ted's fortunes began to change in the fall of 1969 when he re-enrolled at the University of Washington with a renewed sense of purpose. During this period, he met Elizabeth Klopfer, also known as Liz Kendall, at the Sandpiper Tavern in Seattle. Their meeting marked the beginning of a 6-year relationship that would span Ted's entire known killing spree. Klopfer, a divorced single mother working as an administrative assistant at the University of Washington, was immediately attracted to Ted's charm and apparent gentleness with her young daughter, Molly. The relationship with Klopfer provided Ted with stability and a semblance of normalcy, but it was also marked by his emotional unavailability and manipulative behavior. Klopfer later described their relationship as tumultuous, with Ted frequently disappearing for days without explanation and displaying sudden mood swings that left her confused and hurt. Despite these red flags, she remained devoted to him, desperately wanting the commitment that Ted seemed unwilling to provide. During this period, Ted also became involved in local Republican politics, working on campaigns and developing connections that would later serve as character references. His political involvement gave him an air of respectability and helped him develop the charming, persuasive persona that would make him so effective at luring victims. He even received a letter of recommendation from the Republican governor of Washington after working on his re-election campaign. In 1972, Ted graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in psychology, earning distinction for his academic performance. One of his professors was so impressed that he wrote in a recommendation letter, "I regret Mr. Bundy's decision to pursue a career in law rather than to continue his professional training in psychology. Our loss is your gain." This academic success marked a high point in Ted's legitimate achievements, but it also provided him with psychological insights that he would later use to manipulate and control his victims. Ted's volunteer work at a crisis hotline during this period introduced him to Ann Rule, a former police officer turned crime writer who was also volunteering at the facility. Rule later described Ted as charming, intelligent, and seemingly compassionate, qualities that made their later friendship all the more shocking when she realized the truth about his double life. Their work together at the crisis center, where Ted counseled suicidal callers, provided a stark contrast to the violence he would soon inflict on innocent women. In 1973, Ted was accepted to law school at the University of Utah, but not before executing a calculated plan for revenge against Stephanie Brooks. During a business trip to California in the summer of 1973, Ted rekindled his relationship with Brooks, presenting himself as a mature, successful man headed for law school. He courted her intensively, and she was impressed by his apparent transformation. When Brooks finally agreed to marry him, Ted abruptly ended the relationship without explanation, leaving her confused and hurt. This act of revenge satisfied Ted's need for control and retribution, but it also marked a turning point toward his more violent tendencies. The psychological profile that emerged during these college years revealed a complex individual capable of great charm and apparent empathy, while harboring deep-seated rage and narcissistic tendencies. Ted's ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining loving relationships while simultaneously developing homicidal fantasies, demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation that would characterize his later crimes. The foundation was now set for the horror that would begin in 1974, as Ted's need for control and his rage toward women would soon take its most deadly form. The year 1974 marked the beginning of Ted Bundy's known killing spree, a period that would terrorize the Pacific Northwest and forever change how America viewed serial crime. The transformation from fantasy to reality appears to have been triggered by his rejection of Stephanie Brooks and his growing confidence from his academic and political successes. The first known attack occurred on January 4, 1974, when Ted broke into the basement bedroom of 18-year-old Joni Lenz in Seattle. He brutally bludgeoned her with a metal rod from her bed frame and sexually assaulted her with a speculum taken from her dresser. Miraculously, Lenz survived the attack, but suffered permanent physical and neurological damage. This assault established the pattern of extreme violence and sexual sadism that would characterize all of Ted's subsequent crimes. 1 month later, on February 1, 1974, Ted committed what is considered his first murder when he abducted 21-year-old Linda and Healy from her basement bedroom near the University of Washington campus. Healy, known for giving the morning ski reports on local radio, vanished without a trace from her bed, leaving behind only bloodstains on her pillow and nightgown. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a terrifying pattern that would claim the lives of numerous young women across multiple states. Throughout the spring and summer of 1974, Ted's killing spree escalated with methodical precision. In March, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson disappeared from the Evergreen State College campus in Olympia. April saw the disappearance of 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt from Central Washington University. May brought the abduction of 20-year-old Roberta Kathy Parks from Oregon State University. Each victim fit a similar profile: attractive, college-aged women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. The most audacious and public of Ted's early crimes occurred on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, where thousands of people were enjoying a beautiful summer day. On this single day, Ted abducted 2 women, 23-year-old Janice Ott and 19-year-old Denise Naslund. Multiple witnesses observed a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, introducing himself as Ted and asking for help with his sailboat. This bold daylight abduction in front of numerous witnesses demonstrated Ted's growing confidence and his ability to exploit people's natural tendency to help someone who appeared injured and harmless. Janice Ott was seen leaving with the man calling himself Ted around 12:30 p.m., with witnesses noting she asked if her bicycle would fit in his car, to which he replied, "It will fit in the trunk." Denise Naslund disappeared later that afternoon while walking to the restroom. The bodies of both women were found 2 months later in a wooded area near Issaquah, along with the remains of other victims. Ted's methods during this period revealed sophisticated planning and psychological manipulation. He typically approached victims in public places while feigning injury, using crutches, a sling, or a cast to appear vulnerable and non-threatening. This ruse exploited his victims' compassion and their natural instinct to help someone in apparent distress. Once he gained their trust and lured them to his car, he would overpower them with weapons he had concealed in his Volkswagen Beetle. His car had been modified for his crimes, with the passenger seat often removed to create space for victims to lie hidden as he drove away. He kept tools of restraint and violence readily available: handcuffs, rope, a crowbar, and other weapons that he used to control and ultimately kill his victims. The level of premeditation involved in these modifications and preparations demonstrated that Ted's crimes were not impulsive acts, but carefully calculated attacks. The investigation into these disappearances was hampered by the lack of coordination between different jurisdictions and the unprecedented nature of serial killing at the time. Detective Robert Keppel of the King County Sheriff's Office emerged as the primary investigator, painstakingly compiling evidence and witness descriptions. The similarities between cases, the victims' physical appearance, their disappearances from college campuses, and the mysterious man named Ted began to form a pattern that would eventually lead to Ted's identification. During this killing spree, Ted was simultaneously maintaining his relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer and attending law school at the University of Utah, which he began in September 1974. His ability to compartmentalize his life was extraordinary. He could commit brutal murders one day and return home to play the role of loving boyfriend and dedicated student the next. Klopfer later recalled noticing changes in Ted's behavior during this period. He seemed more distant, was often absent for unexplained periods, and had developed what she described as a cold look in his eyes. The psychological dynamics driving Ted's escalation during this period reveal a complex interplay of narcissism, sexual sadism, and an insatiable need for control. Each successful attack fed his sense of power and superiority, while the media attention and public fear only reinforced his belief in his own cleverness and invincibility. The fact that he could continue his normal life while secretly being responsible for such horror gave him a godlike sense of power over life and death that became increasingly addictive. By the end of 1974, Ted had likely killed at least 8 women, though the exact number remains unknown. His confidence was growing, his methods were becoming more refined, and his geographical reach was expanding as he moved between Washington, Oregon, and Utah. The foundation had been laid for what would become one of the most extensive and terrifying murder sprees in American criminal history. The beginning of Ted Bundy's downfall started with a routine traffic stop that would eventually unravel his carefully constructed facade. On August 16, 1975, in the early morning hours, Utah Highway Patrol Trooper Bob Hayward attempted to stop Ted's Volkswagen Beetle for a minor traffic violation in Salt Lake City. Ted's suspicious behavior, turning off his headlights and speeding through stop signs in an apparent attempt to evade the officer, immediately aroused Hayward's suspicions. When Trooper Hayward finally stopped the vehicle, he discovered a collection of items that painted a sinister picture: handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, rope, a ski mask with eye holes cut out, and notably, the front passenger seat had been removed. Ted claimed he had simply been to see a movie and offered innocent explanations for each item, but the combination was too suspicious to ignore. He was arrested on charges of possession of burglary tools. The arrest proved to be the breakthrough that investigators across multiple states had been desperately seeking. The items found in Ted's car matched descriptions from the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch in November 1974. Duranch, an 18-year-old woman from Murray, Utah, had narrowly escaped when a man identifying himself as Officer Roseland attempted to handcuff her after claiming someone had tried to break into her car at a shopping mall. During their struggle, he had inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, allowing Duranch to escape. When presented with a police lineup, Duranch positively identified Ted as her attacker. This identification provided investigators with their first concrete link between Ted and the string of disappearances that had plagued the region. Detective Robert Keppel, who had been investigating the Washington murders, immediately recognized the significance of this arrest. The investigation that followed revealed the methodical nature of Ted's crimes and his sophisticated ability to evade detection. Keppel had spent months analyzing thousands of automobile registration records, feeding them into mainframe computers to identify potential suspects. Ted's name had appeared on the list due to witness descriptions of a man named Ted driving a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle, but he hadn't stood out among the hundreds of other potential suspects until his arrest. Meanwhile, detectives in Colorado had been investigating the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse from Michigan who had disappeared while vacationing at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village in January 1975. Campbell had vanished after leaving the lobby of the ski resort where she was staying with her fiancé. Her nude body was found a month later on a dirt road outside of town, beaten to death with a blunt instrument. During a search of Ted's car and residence, investigators found hair fibers that forensically matched samples taken from Karen Campbell, providing crucial physical evidence linking him to the Colorado murder. Additional evidence included witness testimony placing a man matching Ted's description at the Wildwood Inn on the night of Campbell's disappearance. On February 23, 1976, Ted went on trial in Utah for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch. Despite his confident demeanor and attempts at self-representation, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Judge Stuart Hansen, presiding over a bench trial that Ted had requested instead of a jury trial, found him guilty of aggravated kidnapping. Ted was sentenced to a term of 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. During this period, Elizabeth Klopfer was grappling with the horrifying possibility that the man she loved could be responsible for the disappearances and murders she had been reading about in the newspapers. The similarities were too numerous to ignore. Ted's physical appearance matched witness descriptions. He drove the same type of car, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Despite her emotional attachment to him, Klopfer made the difficult decision to contact police in both Seattle and Salt Lake City, providing them with Ted's name and personal information. Her calls to police added crucial weight to the mounting evidence against Ted. Detective Keppel later credited Klopfer's information as being instrumental in solidifying Ted as a serious suspect. However, her decision to cooperate with authorities came at great personal cost, as she struggled with guilt and conflicted feelings about potentially sending the father figure in her daughter's life to prison. While Ted was imprisoned in Utah, Colorado authorities were building their case for Karen Campbell's murder. The evidence was strong enough that in October 1976, Ted was charged with first-degree murder in Campbell's death. The extradition process began, with Colorado authorities requesting Ted's transfer to stand trial for murder, a charge that carried the potential death penalty. Ted's behavior during his imprisonment revealed his manipulative nature and his continued belief in his own superiority. He spent hours in the prison law library, studying legal precedents and planning his defense strategies. Fellow inmates later reported that Ted seemed to enjoy the attention his case was generating and appeared confident that he could beat the charges against him. The psychological evaluation conducted during this period provided the first professional assessment of Ted's mental state. He was diagnosed by Dr. Al Carlisle as having antisocial personality disorder, though Ted himself was dismissive of any suggestion that he had psychological problems. The evaluation noted his superficial charm, his lack of genuine empathy, and his grandiose sense of self-worth, all classic indicators of psychopathy. As 1976 drew to a close, Ted was preparing for his transfer to Colorado to face murder charges, still maintaining his innocence and confident in his ability to manipulate the legal system. What he hadn't anticipated was that his imprisonment would only provide investigators more time to build their cases, and that his own arrogance would lead to decisions that would ultimately seal his fate. The stage was set for the dramatic events that would unfold in 1977, including 2 daring escape attempts that would captivate the nation and lead to even more horrific crimes. Ted Bundy's 2 spectacular escapes from custody in Colorado became legendary examples of his cunning and the dangerous underestimation of his capabilities by law enforcement. These escapes would not only demonstrate his intelligence and determination, but would also lead to some of his most heinous crimes and ultimately to his final downfall. The first escape, Aspen Courthouse in January 1977, Ted was extradited from Utah to Picken County, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. The move to the small mountain town of Aspen presented opportunities that Ted was quick to recognize and exploit. The Picken County Courthouse, where he was to stand trial, was located in the same building as the jail and law library, a setup that would prove fatally flawed. Ted was allowed to serve as his own attorney, a decision that gave him unprecedented freedom of movement within the courthouse. The judge had ruled that he didn't need to wear leg shackles or handcuffs during court proceedings, allowing him to walk freely to the law library located on the 2nd floor of the building. This privilege was granted based on his status as an educated defendant representing himself and the belief that he posed minimal flight risk. During the months leading up to his escape, Ted carefully studied the courthouse layout and routine, noting security weaknesses and planning his move. Over the months, I had noticed a number of opportunities to just walk right out, Bundy later told prison psychologist Dr. Al Carlisle in recorded phone conversations. I'd thought a great deal about escape, and I don't know if I had the guts to do it, quite frankly. On June 7, 1977, Ted finally seized his opportunity. While researching in the law library, he noticed that the guard had stepped outside for a smoke break, leaving him alone. The windows are open, and the fresh air is blowing through. And the sky was blue, and I said, "I'm ready to go," and walked to the window and jumped out, Ted later recounted. He leaped from the 2nd-story window of the courthouse and immediately headed for the surrounding mountains. Ted's escape plan was remarkably unprepared. "I had no plan. I had nobody helping me. I had no money. I had no nothing," he admitted. For 6 days, he survived in the mountains by breaking into cabins for food and shelter. Eventually, hunger and the harsh mountain conditions forced him back towards civilization. He stole a car in Aspen, but his inexperience with manual transmission caused the vehicle to stall and weave erratically, attracting the attention of Deputy Sheriff Rick Krolichek. who arrested him. Despite the failure of his first escape, Ted had proven that he was capable of exploiting security weaknesses and that underestimating him was a dangerous mistake. The escape also provided him with valuable experience and confidence that he would use to plan his second, more successful attempt. The second escape, Garfield County Jail. Following his recapture, Ted was transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where security was believed to be more robust. However, this facility would prove equally vulnerable to Ted's ingenuity and determination. The jail was located in an older building with construction features that Ted would exploit to his advantage. During his imprisonment in Glenwood Springs, Ted began losing weight, dropping from his normal 175 pounds to approximately 140 pounds. This weight loss was not accidental. It was a calculated part of his escape plan. Ted had discovered that he could access the ceiling of his cell through a light fixture, but the opening was too small for his normal-sized frame. By deliberately starving himself, he made his body small enough to fit through the narrow passage. Ted also used his time in jail to study the building's structure and the guards' routines. He learned that the jailer lived in an apartment adjacent to the jail, and that there was access to this apartment through the ceiling space above the cells. He spent months carefully widening the opening in his cell's ceiling and planning his route through the building's infrastructure. On December 30th, 1977, Ted put his plan into action. Using law books and pillows arranged under his blanket to simulate a sleeping body, he created the illusion that he was in his cell. He then squeezed through the opening he had prepared in the ceiling and crawled through the building's ductwork and plumbing passages. The route led him to a closet in the jailer's apartment, which was unoccupied at the time. Once in the apartment, Ted put on civilian clothes he found there and simply walked out of the building into the night. His escape wasn't discovered until late Saturday afternoon of December 31st, giving him nearly 18 hours of head start. This time, Ted was far better prepared for life as a fugitive. Flight to Florida. Ted's second escape demonstrated the criminal sophistication he had developed during his years of planning and killing. Rather than heading for the mountains as he had during his first escape, Ted had prepared a more elaborate plan for disappearing entirely. He made his way to Denver, where he boarded a flight to Chicago. From Chicago, he took an Amtrak train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, then drove south to Atlanta, Georgia, before finally boarding a Trailways bus to Tallahassee, Florida. His choice of Florida was strategic. It was far from the western states where he was known to law enforcement, had a warm climate suitable for a fugitive, and was home to a large state university where he could blend in among the student population. He traveled under the alias Chris Hagen, using identification he had either stolen or forged during his journey. By January 8, 1978, Ted had arrived in Tallahassee and taken up residence at the Oak House, a rooming house near the Florida State University campus. He was now over 2,000 miles from Colorado, with a new identity and apparent freedom to start over. However, the psychological compulsions that had driven him to kill before had not been satisfied by his escape. They had only been temporarily suspended. Psychological analysis of Ted's escapes revealed crucial aspects of his personality and psychological makeup that would prove important in understanding his overall criminal behavior. His ability to plan meticulously while maintaining the facade of a cooperative prisoner demonstrated his capacity for long-term deception and manipulation. The risks he was willing to take, including the potentially fatal jump from the courthouse window, showed his narcissistic belief in his own abilities and his willingness to gamble everything for freedom. The fact that both escapes were accomplished through intelligence and planning rather than violence also reflected Ted's preference for psychological manipulation over physical confrontation when possible. He derived satisfaction not just from the freedom his escapes provided, but from the intellectual challenge of outwitting the authorities and the media attention his dramatic flights generated. However, the escapes also demonstrated the dangerous underestimation of Ted's capabilities by law enforcement. The privileges granted to him because of his education and apparently cooperative demeanor reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of his true nature. This pattern of underestimation would continue to plague the investigation throughout his criminal career. The stage was now set for the final and most horrific chapter of Ted's criminal career. Free in Florida with a new identity, He was positioned to commit crimes that would surpass even his previous acts of violence in their brutality and audacity. The escapes that had seemed like victories would ultimately lead to his final downfall and execution. Ted Bundy's arrival in Florida marked the beginning of the most brutal and reckless period of his criminal career. Free from the constraints of prison and emboldened by his successful escapes, Ted was now operating in an environment where he was unknown to local law enforcement, giving him a dangerous sense of invincibility that would lead to his most heinous acts. The Chi Omega Massacre in the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, just 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Ted launched an attack that would become synonymous with his name and cement his place in criminal history. At approximately 3 a.m., he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through a faulty back door lock. What followed was 15 minutes of unprecedented brutality that would forever traumatize a university community and shock the nation. Ted moved through the sorority house like a predator, attacking sleeping victims with a piece of firewood he had brought as a weapon. His first victim was 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, whom he brutally bludgeoned in her bed before strangling her with pantyhose. The savage nature of the attack was evident from the skull fractures and other injuries found on her body. Lisa Levy, a 20-year-old criminology student, was Ted's second victim that night. She was also beaten and strangled, but the attack on Levy revealed an even more disturbing aspect of Ted's violence. He bit her left buttock, leaving distinctive teeth marks that would later become crucial evidence in his prosecution. The bite mark demonstrated the sexual nature of Ted's violence and his complete loss of control during the attack. 2 other Chi Omega residents, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were also brutally attacked but survived. Chandler suffered a broken jaw and lost several teeth, while Kleiner sustained a broken jaw and severe lacerations. Both women were left with permanent physical and emotional scars from their encounters with Ted, but their survival provided crucial testimony about the attacks. The total time Ted spent in the sorority house was estimated at less than 15 minutes, during which he attacked 4 women in their beds. The speed and efficiency of the attacks demonstrated both his experience as a killer and the depth of his rage. More than 30 witnesses were within earshot of the sorority house during the attacks, yet none heard anything due to the swift and brutal nature of Ted's assault. The Cheryl Thomas attack, Ted's violence didn't end at Chi Omega. Approximately 8 blocks away from the sorority house, he broke into the basement apartment of 21-year-old FSU student Cheryl Thomas. Thomas was brutally beaten with the same piece of firewood, suffering a dislocated shoulder and fractures to her jaw and skull in 5 places. The attack left her with permanent deafness in her left ear and equilibrium damage that ended her promising dance career. Thomas survived only because her attack was interrupted by a neighbor who called 911 after hearing sounds of violence. Police found a semen stain on Thomas's bed and a pantyhose mask containing hair similar to Ted's, providing additional physical evidence linking him to the crimes. The attack on Thomas showed that Ted's rampage was not limited to the sorority house, but represented a broader pattern of violence against young women in the area. The Kimberly Leach murder, Ted's final known murder, was also his most shocking, involving a child victim that horrified even hardened investigators. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom at Lake City Junior High School to retrieve a forgotten purse and never returned to class. Ted had abducted the young girl in broad daylight from her school, demonstrating an unprecedented level of audacity and recklessness. For 7 weeks, Kimberly's disappearance sparked an intensive search involving hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers. Her partially mummified remains were finally found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. The condition of the body and the remote location where it was discovered spoke to the premeditated nature of Ted's crime and his familiarity with the area. Forensic examination revealed that Kimberly had been sexually assaulted before having her throat cut and her genitals mutilated with a knife. The extreme brutality of the crime against such a young victim represented a new low in Ted's criminal career and demonstrated his complete lack of moral boundaries. The murder of Kimberly Leach would ultimately result in Ted's 3rd death sentence and was often cited as the crime that sealed his fate. Attempted abduction of Leslie Parmenter. Ted's reckless behavior during his Florida crime spree extended beyond his successful attacks. On February 8, 1978, the day before abducting Kimberly Leach, Ted attempted to abduct 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter in a Jacksonville parking lot. Ted approached Parmenter, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but retreated when Parmenter's older brother arrived and confronted him. This incident was particularly significant because Leslie Parmenter was the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives. Ted's attempt to abduct the daughter of a high-ranking police official demonstrated either incredible audacity or a complete loss of judgment. The failed abduction attempt provided additional evidence of Ted's presence in Florida and his continued predatory behavior. Psychological deterioration. The crimes Ted committed in Florida revealed a significant deterioration in his psychological state and criminal methodology. Unlike his earlier murders, which were characterized by careful planning and disposal of evidence, the Florida attacks were reckless, public, and left substantial physical evidence. The fact that he attacked multiple victims in a single location during a short time frame suggested a loss of the control and calculation that had previously characterized his crimes. Several factors likely contributed to this deterioration: the stress of being a fugitive, the psychological pressure of his escapes, and possibly the satisfaction he derived from successfully evading capture for so long. The escalation in violence, from primarily targeting college-aged women to attacking a child, also suggested that his previous crimes were no longer providing the psychological satisfaction he craved. The sexual nature of the attacks, evidenced by the bite mark on Lisa Levy and the assault on Kimberly Leach, revealed the deeply pathological nature of Ted's motivations. These crimes were not simply about killing. They were about complete domination and the expression of sexual violence that had been building throughout his criminal career. Investigation and evidence. The Florida crimes provided law enforcement with more physical evidence than any of Ted's previous attacks. The bite mark on Lisa Levy would prove particularly crucial, as dental impressions could be matched to Ted's teeth with scientific precision. Hair fibers found at multiple crime scenes, eyewitness testimony, and other physical evidence created a web of proof that would be much more difficult for Ted to explain away than the largely circumstantial evidence from his earlier crimes. The investigation was also aided by improved communication between law enforcement agencies and the development of better forensic techniques. The lessons learned from Ted's earlier escapes and the difficulties in building cases against him in other states led to a more coordinated and thorough approach to gathering evidence in Florida. The horror of Ted's Florida crimes marked the end of his career as a serial killer, but they also ensured that he would face the ultimate penalty for his actions. The evidence gathered from these attacks would prove sufficient to secure not just convictions, but death sentences that would survive the lengthy appeals process. Ted's final rampage had satisfied his immediate violent impulses, but it had also sealed his fate in ways that his earlier, more careful crimes had not. Ted Bundy's Florida trials marked a watershed moment in American criminal justice, becoming the first nationally televised murder trials and transforming Ted from a notorious criminal into a macabre celebrity. The proceedings revealed both the strength of the evidence against him and his extraordinary ability to manipulate public perception even while facing the death penalty. Capture and initial proceedings. Ted's final capture came on February 15, 1978, when Pensacola police officer David Lee pulled over a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle for erratic driving. The driver initially identified himself as Kenneth Meisner, but his suspicious behavior and appearance led to his arrest. After several days in custody and extensive questioning by multiple law enforcement agencies, Ted finally revealed his true identity. The revelation that the man in custody was the escaped Colorado murder suspect and one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Ted had been on the run for 46 days, during which he had committed some of his most brutal crimes. His capture in Florida set the stage for legal proceedings that would captivate the nation and establish new precedents for high-profile criminal trials. The Chi Omega trial. Ted's first Florida trial began on June 25, 1979, in Miami-Dade County, where the case had been moved due to extensive pretrial publicity in Tallahassee. The decision to televise the proceedings was groundbreaking and controversial, marking the first time cameras were allowed in a criminal trial of this magnitude. The media coverage transformed the courtroom into a theater and Ted into a performer who seemed to relish the attention. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was Ted's decision to represent himself, dismissing his experienced defense attorneys in favor of acting as his own counsel. This decision was seen by many legal experts as a critical error, but it allowed Ted to cross-examine witnesses, present evidence, and address the jury directly, opportunities he used to try to charm and manipulate the proceedings. The prosecution's case was built on multiple forms of evidence that created an overwhelming picture of Ted's guilt. Nita Neary, a Chi Omega sister who had returned to the house shortly after the attacks, provided crucial eyewitness testimony. She described seeing a man matching Ted's description leaving the sorority house carrying a piece of wood, and her subsequent identification of Ted proved devastating to his defense. The bite mark evidence proved to be the prosecution's most powerful weapon. Forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Sovereign testified that the bite mark left on Lisa Levy's left buttock matched Ted's dental impressions with scientific certainty. The prosecution presented enlarged photographs of the bite mark alongside impressions of Ted's teeth, creating a visual comparison that was compelling to the jury. This forensic evidence represented a new development in criminal prosecution and established important precedents for the use of bite mark analysis in court. Additional evidence included hair fibers found at the crime scene that matched samples taken from Ted, eyewitness testimony placing him in the area at the time of the attacks, and physical evidence from his apartment and possessions. The cumulative weight of this evidence created a case that even Ted's considerable charm and legal maneuvering could not overcome. During the trial, Ted's behavior revealed the complex psychology that had driven his crimes. He appeared confident, even cocky, often smiling and waving at the cameras. His cross-examination of witnesses was skilled and sometimes effective, demonstrating the intelligence and legal knowledge that had helped him evade capture for so long. However, his obvious enjoyment of the attention and his inability to show genuine remorse for his alleged crimes created a disturbing spectacle that horrified observers. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted guilty on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the attacks on Cheryl Thomas, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner. The speed of the verdict reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. The penalty phase of the trial revealed the depth of impact Ted's crimes had on the victims and their families. Emotional testimony from survivors and family members painted a picture of lives forever changed by his violence. Despite Ted's attempts to present mitigating evidence and his own testimony asking for mercy, the jury recommended death sentences for both murder counts. The Kimberly Leach trial, Ted's second Florida trial, began on January 7, 1980, in Orlando, where the case had been moved from Lake City. This trial focused on the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime that had shocked even those familiar with Ted's previous violence. The prosecution of a child murder case required different strategies and presented unique emotional challenges for all involved. The evidence in the Leach case was largely circumstantial but compelling. Eyewitnesses placed Ted in Lake City on the day of Kimberly's disappearance. Fiber evidence linked him to the victim, and his behavior during the time period was consistent with having committed the crime. The discovery of Kimberly's body in a remote location that Ted could have known about further strengthened the prosecution's case. During this trial, Ted executed one of the most bizarre moments in American legal history when he married Carol Ann Boone while she was testifying as a character witness. Boone, a former co-worker from Washington State who had maintained her belief in Ted's innocence, had moved to Florida to support him during his trials. Ted's knowledge of Florida law allowed him to exploit a legal loophole that recognized declarations of marriage made in open court as legally binding. The courtroom marriage was calculated theater designed to humanize Ted in the eyes of the jury and generate sympathy. When Ted asked Boone, "Will you marry me?" while she was on the witness stand and she responded yes, he completed the ceremony by stating, "Then I do hereby marry you." The judge's presence made the union legally valid under Florida law, though it was denied by jail officials when they later applied for a formal marriage license. Despite the dramatic gesture and Boone's passionate testimony about Ted's character, the evidence against him was sufficient for conviction. On February 7, 1980, the jury found Ted guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping in Kimberly Leach's death. 3 days later, he was sentenced to death for the 3rd time, ensuring that even if his other death sentences were overturned on appeal, he would still face execution. Media coverage and public fascination. The extensive media coverage of Ted's trials created a phenomenon that was both fascinating and disturbing. Ted's handsome appearance, intelligence, and charm created a cognitive dissonance for the public. He didn't fit the stereotypical image of a serial killer. This disconnect led to a perverse fascination with Ted that included fan mail, marriage proposals, and even groupies who attended his trials. The media coverage also sparked important debates about the ethics of televised criminal proceedings and the potential for such coverage to glorify criminals. Ted's obvious enjoyment of the attention and his skill at manipulating media coverage raised questions about whether the publicity was serving justice or merely providing entertainment. Feminist criminologists criticized the media's portrayal of Ted as a romantic figure, arguing that it trivialized the suffering of his victims and reinforced dangerous stereotypes about violence against women. The coverage often focused more on Ted's charisma and intelligence than on the brutal reality of his crimes, creating a narrative that some argued was more sympathetic to the killer than to his victims. Legal significance: Ted's trials established important precedents in criminal law, particularly in the areas of self-representation, televised proceedings, and forensic evidence. His decision to represent himself demonstrated both the rights of defendants and the potential pitfalls of exercising those rights without proper legal training. The bite mark evidence that proved crucial to his conviction helped establish the scientific validity of forensic odontology in criminal cases. The trials also highlighted the importance of coordination between law enforcement agencies and the value of physical evidence in prosecuting serial crimes. The lessons learned from the difficulties in prosecuting Ted's earlier crimes led to improved investigative techniques and better preservation of evidence that made the Florida convictions possible. The media coverage of the trials changed the landscape of criminal justice reporting and established precedents for how high-profile cases would be covered in the future. The balance between public interest and the rights of defendants and victims became an ongoing concern that continues to influence legal proceedings today. By the end of 1980, Ted Bundy faced 3 death sentences and the prospect of spending the rest of his life on death row, while his appeals worked their way through the courts. The trials had revealed the full extent of his crimes and provided some measure of justice for his victims, but they had also created a legacy of public fascination with serial killers that would influence American culture for decades to come. Ted Bundy's 8 years on death row at Florida State Prison represented a complex period of psychological manipulation, legal maneuvering, and ultimately, limited cooperation with law enforcement. During this time, he would transform from a defiant defendant maintaining his innocence to a condemned man desperately trading information for time, revealing the full scope of his crimes in his final days. Life on death row: Ted's life at Florida State Prison was a stark contrast to the freedom and control he had enjoyed throughout his criminal career. Confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day, he was forced to confront the reality of his situation while maintaining the psychological defenses that had sustained him throughout his trials. Despite these restrictions, Ted continued to demonstrate his manipulative abilities and his need for attention and control. His cell became a hub of correspondence with journalists, researchers, and admirers who were fascinated by his case. Ted maintained an extensive letter-writing campaign, carefully crafting his image and controlling the narrative about his crimes even while imprisoned. These letters revealed his continued narcissism and his belief that he was somehow special or different from other criminals. Ted's relationship with Carol and Boone continued during his early years on death row, and she gave birth to their daughter, Rose Bundy, in 1982. The conception occurred during conjugal visits that were arranged through Boone's connections and Ted's manipulation of prison protocols. The birth of his daughter provided Ted with another tool for emotional manipulation and generated additional media attention about his case. In July 1984, prison guards discovered 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Ted's cell, along with evidence that he had sawed through a steel bar in his cell window and glued it back in place with homemade soap-based adhesive. This escape attempt demonstrated that, even on death row, Ted continued to plan and scheme, refusing to accept his fate passively. The discovery led to increased security measures and closer monitoring of his activities. The Green River Killer consultation in October 1984, Ted made a calculated decision to reach out to law enforcement, offering his expertise in the ongoing investigation of the Green River Killer. He contacted Detective Robert Keppel, who had been instrumental in his original investigation, proposing that his insights into serial killer psychology could help solve the case that was terrorizing the Seattle area. The offer represented a strategic move by Ted to demonstrate his value to law enforcement while positioning himself as a cooperative prisoner. Detective Keppel and Green River Task Force Detective Dave Reichert interviewed Ted extensively, though Gary Ridgway remained at large for another 17 years. The interviews provided law enforcement with valuable insights into serial killer behavior, even though they didn't immediately solve the Green River case. Ted's cooperation in the Green River investigation revealed his deep understanding of criminal psychology and his ability to analyze other killers' behaviors. His insights into victim selection, disposal methods, and the psychological motivations driving serial crimes demonstrated the sophisticated criminal mind that had made him so successful at evading capture. However, his cooperation was always calculated and self-serving, designed to extend his life and maintain his relevance. The FBI interviews with Bill Hagmaier. The most significant relationship Ted developed during his death row years was with FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier, who began interviewing him in 1984 as part of the Bureau's effort to understand serial killer psychology. Hagmaier, a criminal profiler with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, spent over 200 hours interviewing Ted between 1984 and 1989, developing what Ted called a friendship. The relationship between Ted and Hagmaier was complex and psychologically intense. Ted, starved for intellectual stimulation and meaningful human contact, found in Hagmaier someone who could engage with him on an intellectual level without being manipulated or deceived. Hagmaier, for his part, maintained professional distance while developing the rapport necessary to gain Ted's trust and extract valuable information. During these interviews, Ted began to reveal details about his crimes that he had never shared before. He discussed his methods, his psychological state during attacks, and the post-mortem activities he engaged in with his victims' bodies. These revelations included his practice of returning to dump sites to engage in necrophilia with decomposing corpses and his ritual activities with severed heads. Ted told Hagmaier about his use of makeup and hairstyling on some victims after death, treating their bodies as objects for his continued control and gratification. He described visits to Taylor Mountain and other dump sites where he would spend entire nights with victims' remains, engaging in sexual activities until decomposition made it impossible to continue. These admissions revealed the depth of his pathology and the extent of his crimes beyond the actual murders. Psychological deterioration and desperation as Ted's execution date approached and his appeals were exhausted, his psychological state began to deteriorate noticeably. The confident, charming manipulator who had dominated his trials was replaced by an increasingly desperate man facing the reality of his impending death. His letters to family and friends revealed fear, regret, and a growing awareness that his execution was inevitable. The relationship with Carol and Boone began to deteriorate as Ted's true nature became impossible to deny. After years of maintaining his innocence and manipulating Boone's devotion, the mounting evidence and Ted's own admissions made it clear that he was guilty of the crimes for which he had been convicted. Boone gradually distanced herself from Ted, eventually stopping her visits and correspondence. Ted's desperation became particularly evident in his final years when he began reaching out to various law enforcement agencies, offering to confess to unsolved murders in exchange for stays of execution. These offers were transparently self-serving attempts to buy time, but they also provided families of victims with closure and gave law enforcement valuable information about unsolved cases. The final confessions in the days immediately preceding his execution, Ted finally began providing the comprehensive confessions that law enforcement had sought for years. These confessions came not from genuine remorse, but from a last desperate attempt to delay his execution by trading information for time. As his attorney Polly Nelson later observed, Ted always thought that his knowledge of these crimes was his ace in the hole. During marathon interview sessions lasting up to 20 hours, Ted confessed to murders across 7 states, providing details that only the killer could have known. He admitted to 30 murders, but hinted that the actual number might be much higher, telling investigators to add 1 digit to that, and you'll have it. This would suggest a victim count in the hundreds, though many of these claims remain unverified. Ted's confessions revealed the geographic scope of his crimes and the sophisticated planning that went into each attack. He provided details about dump sites, victim selection criteria, and methods of disposal that helped law enforcement solve cold cases and provide closure to families. However, even in his final confessions, Ted withheld certain information, using the promise of additional revelations to try to negotiate for more time. The confessions also revealed the psychological motivations behind Ted's crimes. He spoke about the power he felt over his victims and his belief that he was their God, controlling their lives and deaths. He described the sexual gratification he derived from the complete domination of his victims and the continued control he maintained over their bodies after death. Final years and isolation. Ted's final years on death row were marked by increasing isolation as former supporters abandoned him and the reality of his crimes became undeniable. His daughter Rose, now a young child, was kept away from him as Carol and Boone sought to protect her from the truth about her father. Ted's correspondence decreased, and his attempts to maintain relationships with journalists and researchers became less successful as public interest shifted to other cases. The man who had once commanded national attention and manipulated media coverage found himself increasingly irrelevant except as a source of information about his own crimes. His attempts to present himself as a reformed individual or a valuable resource for understanding criminal behavior were undermined by the transparency of his self-serving motivations. As January 24, 1989 approached, Ted made final attempts to secure clemency or additional stays of execution, but his options were exhausted. The confessions he had hoped would save his life had only confirmed his guilt and the appropriateness of his death sentence. The psychological manipulator who had controlled so many aspects of his life and the lives of his victims was finally facing a situation he could not talk, charm, or scheme his way out of. The 8 years Ted spent on death row revealed the true nature of his personality and the extent of his crimes in ways that his trials had not. Stripped of the freedom and control that had defined his adult life, he was forced to confront the reality of what he had become and the inevitability of his fate. His death row period provided valuable insights into the criminal mind while demonstrating that even the most sophisticated and intelligent psychopaths are ultimately subject to the consequences of their actions. The final 24 hours of Ted Bundy's life represented the culmination of one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history, as the man who had terrorized multiple states and captured the nation's attention finally faced the ultimate consequence for his crimes. His execution on January 24, 1989, closed a chapter that had begun more than a decade earlier with mysterious disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. Last-minute legal maneuvers as Ted's execution date approached, his legal team made final desperate attempts to secure stays of execution or commutation of his death sentence. These efforts included appeals to the Florida Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and Governor Bob Martinez, but the overwhelming evidence of Ted's guilt and the heinous nature of his crimes made success unlikely. Ted himself had exhausted much of his credibility through years of manipulation and false promises of cooperation. The final appeals focused on claims of mental incompetence and inadequate legal representation during his trials. Ted's attorneys argued that his decision to represent himself had been a mistake that compromised his defense, but courts had consistently ruled that he had been competent to make that choice and that it had been made knowingly and voluntarily. His obvious intelligence and sophisticated understanding of legal procedures undermined any claims of incompetence. In his final weeks, Ted continued his strategy of offering information about unsolved murders in exchange for additional time. He contacted law enforcement agencies across the country, promising revelations about cold cases if his execution was postponed. However, these offers were seen as transparent attempts to manipulate the system rather than genuine cooperation, and they failed to generate the stays he desperately sought. Final interviews and confessions. Ted's final interviews with FBI agent Bill Hagmaier occurred in the days immediately before his execution, as Ted finally abandoned his decades-long claims of innocence and provided detailed confessions to multiple murders. These sessions, lasting many hours, revealed the full scope of his criminal activity and provided law enforcement with information about cases that had remained unsolved for years. During these final confessions, Ted admitted to murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, California, Idaho, and Florida, spanning the period from 1973 to 1978. He provided specific details about victim selection, methods of killing, and disposal of bodies that only the perpetrator could have known. These admissions finally gave families closure about the fates of their loved ones while confirming law enforcement's suspicions about the scope of Ted's crimes. Ted also revealed the psychological aspects of his crimes that had driven him for so many years. He described the power he felt over his victims and the sexual gratification he derived from complete control over another human being. His admissions about necrophilia and the extended time he spent with victims' corpses sources provided disturbing insights into the depths of his pathology. One of the most significant aspects of these final confessions was Ted's attempt to blame his crimes on pornography, particularly violent pornography that he claimed had influenced his development. In his final interview with Christian psychologist James Dobson, Ted argued that pornography was a contributing factor to his violence, though critics noted this appeared to be another attempt at manipulation rather than genuine remorse. Ted's final day began before dawn on January 24, 1989, as he prepared for his execution scheduled for 7 a.m. He had refused his last meal, choosing instead to have the standard prison fare. His final hours were spent meeting with his spiritual advisor, Methodist minister Fred Lawrence, and his attorney Jim Coleman. Ted made 2 final phone calls to his mother, Louise Bundy, during which he apologized for the pain he had caused his family. According to witnesses, he told her, "I'm so sorry I've given you all such grief, but a part of me was hidden all the time." These conversations represented one of the few times Ted showed what appeared to be genuine emotion about the impact of his actions on others. As the execution time approached, Ted met with the prison chaplain and attempted to make peace with his impending death. However, even in his final hours, he continued to demonstrate the narcissistic traits that had characterized his entire adult life, expressing more concern about his own fate than about his victims or their families. The execution at 7:16 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 24, 1989. Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair at Rayford State Prison. His final words were directed to his attorney and spiritual advisor, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The execution was witnessed by 48 people, including law enforcement officials, government representatives, and members of the media. The execution itself was carried out according to Florida protocol, with Ted strapped into the electric chair known as Old Sparky. The procedure was completed efficiently, ending the life of one of America's most notorious criminals after more than a decade on death row. Medical personnel confirmed his death at 7:16 a.m., exactly 42 years after his birth in Vermont. The public reaction to Ted's execution was unprecedented in its celebratory nature. Hundreds of people gathered in a pasture across from the prison, singing, dancing, and setting off fireworks as news of the execution spread. The crowd cheered when the white hearse carrying Ted's body departed the prison, demonstrating the intense public feeling about his crimes and their satisfaction with his punishment. The celebratory atmosphere reflected not just satisfaction with justice served, but also relief that Ted's long manipulation of the legal system had finally ended. For more than a decade, he had used appeals, escapes, and legal maneuvers to delay accountability for his crimes, frustrating law enforcement and the public alike. His execution represented the final victory of justice over his attempts to control and manipulate the system. Local businesses near the prison capitalized on the public interest, selling t-shirts with slogans like "Burn Bundy Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." While some criticized this commercialization of an execution, it reflected the deep public animosity toward Ted and the satisfaction many felt about his fate. Impact on victims' families. For the families of Ted's victims, his execution provided a sense of closure that many had waited years to achieve. Karen Campbell's father, Robert Campbell, spoke to reporters the day before the execution, expressing mixed feelings about capital punishment, but supporting Ted's execution as a necessary consequence of his actions. "You never really forgive someone for something like that," he said. "You just try to put it behind you." Other family members expressed relief that Ted would no longer be able to manipulate the media or a legal system to generate sympathy or attention. His death meant that the focus could finally shift from the killer to remembering and honoring his victims. Many families had struggled with the media attention on Ted at the expense of their loved ones' memories. The execution also meant that Ted could no longer traumatize victims' families with false promises of revealing the locations of remains or providing closure about unsolved cases. His pattern of using information as a bargaining chip had caused additional pain to families who hoped for answers about their missing loved ones. Final disposition. Following his execution, Ted's body was cremated in Gainesville, Florida, in accordance with his will. His ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington state, returning him to the region where his known criminal career had begun. The secretive disposal of his remains was intended to prevent the creation of a shrine or memorial that might glorify his crimes. The decision to scatter his ashes in Washington was controversial, with some arguing that he didn't deserve to be returned to the area where he had caused so much pain. However, his will specified this location, and his family's wishes were respected despite the objections of some victims' advocates. Historical significance: Ted Bundy's execution marked the end of not just a criminal's life, but an era in American criminal justice. His case had transformed public understanding of serial killers, influenced law enforcement techniques, and changed how the media covered high-profile criminal cases. His death closed the most extensively documented serial killer case in American history up to that point. The extensive media coverage of his execution, like his trials, set precedents for how such events would be covered in the future. The balance between public interest and respect for the dignity of legal proceedings remained a contentious issue that his case helped define. Ted's execution also represented a victory for the victims' rights movement and the families who had fought for justice throughout the lengthy legal process. Their persistence in demanding accountability and their refusal to be manipulated by Ted's attempts at sympathy had finally been vindicated. The man who had controlled so many aspects of his victims' final moments was ultimately unable to control his own fate, dying at the appointed time in the manner prescribed by law. His execution served as a reminder that even the most intelligent and manipulative criminals are ultimately subject to justice and the rule of law. Ted Bundy's case fundamentally transformed American law enforcement, criminal psychology, and public understanding of serial crime, leaving a legacy that continues to influence these fields decades after his execution. His sophisticated methods, interstate crimes, and ability to evade capture for years exposed critical weaknesses in the criminal justice system, while simultaneously providing valuable lessons that improved investigative techniques and interagency cooperation. Revolutionizing criminal profiling: the most significant impact of Ted's case was on the development of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis within the FBI. His interviews with Special Agent Bill Hagmaier and other behavioral analysts provided unprecedented insights into the psychology of serial killers, helping to establish the scientific foundation for what would become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Ted's willingness to discuss his crimes in detail during his final years allowed researchers to understand the psychological motivations behind serial killing in ways that had never been possible before. His descriptions of victim selection, the planning process, and the psychological satisfaction he derived from his crimes became foundational knowledge for criminal profilers. These insights help law enforcement develop more accurate profiles of unknown subjects in future cases. The development of the Homicide Investigation Tracking System, HITS, pioneered by Detective Robert Keppel, who had investigated Ted's early crimes, was directly influenced by the challenges faced in linking Ted's crimes across multiple jurisdictions. HITS became a model for information sharing systems that help law enforcement agencies connect similar crimes and identify patterns that might indicate serial offending. Improving interagency coordination: Ted's ability to commit crimes across multiple states while avoiding detection highlighted the critical need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. His case demonstrated how jurisdictional boundaries could be exploited by sophisticated criminals who understood the limitations of local law enforcement communication. The investigations into Ted's crimes led to improved protocols for sharing information between agencies and the establishment of formal mechanisms for coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations. The lessons learned from the difficulties in tracking Ted's movements and connecting his crimes across state lines influenced the development of national databases and communication systems that are now standard in law enforcement. Federal involvement in serial killer investigations became more systematic following Ted's case, with the FBI taking a more active role in providing resources and expertise to local agencies dealing with potentially serial crimes. The recognition that serial killers often operate across jurisdictional boundaries led to protocols that automatically involve federal resources when certain patterns are identified. Forensic science advances the physical evidence that ultimately convicted Ted, particularly the bite mark analysis that proved crucial in his Chi Omega trial, established important precedents for the use of forensic odontology in criminal cases. While bite mark evidence would later become more controversial in forensic science, Ted's case demonstrated the power of physical evidence in linking suspects to crimes even when other evidence was limited. The challenges faced in preserving and analyzing evidence from Ted's crime scenes led to improvements in forensic collection and processing techniques. The recognition that serial killers might return to crime scenes or move bodies after initial disposal influenced how investigators approached and secured potential crime scenes. Ted's case also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records and evidence from unsolved cases, as connections might only become apparent years later when additional crimes provide context. This influenced evidence retention policies and the development of cold case units in major law enforcement agencies. Understanding serial killer psychology, the extensive psychological evaluation of Ted during his trials and death row interviews provided researchers with detailed insights into the development and psychology of serial killers. His case became a foundational study in criminal psychology, influencing how mental health professionals understand and treat antisocial personality disorders and psychopathy. Ted's intelligence, charm, and apparent normalcy challenged existing stereotypes about serial killers and demonstrated that such criminals could be highly functional members of society. This understanding influenced how law enforcement trained officers to look beyond surface appearances when investigating violent crimes. The concept of the organized serial killer, as opposed to disorganized offenders, was partly developed through the study of Ted's methodical approach to his crimes. His careful planning, victim selection, and evidence disposal techniques provided examples of sophisticated criminal behavior that helped profilers categorize and understand different types of serial offenders. Victim advocacy and rights. Ted's case occurred during a period of growing awareness about victims' rights and the need to protect victims and their families from additional trauma during criminal proceedings. His manipulation of the media and legal system to generate sympathy and attention highlighted the need for better protection of victims' interests in high-profile cases. The extensive media coverage of Ted's trials, while groundbreaking in its scope, also demonstrated the potential for such coverage to re-victimize families and shift focus from victims to perpetrators. This led to discussions about ethical guidelines for covering criminal trials and the balance between public interest and victim privacy. The long legal process in Ted's case, including his multiple escapes and extended appeals, illustrated the emotional toll that lengthy criminal proceedings could have on victims' families. This contributed to reforms in the appeals process and the development of victim support services within the criminal justice system. Media and public awareness. Ted's case marked a turning point in how serial crimes were covered by the media and understood by the public. The extensive television coverage of his trials helped create the modern phenomenon of celebrity criminals while simultaneously educating the public about the reality of serial crime. The public fascination with Ted, despite the horrific nature of his crimes, revealed troubling aspects of American culture's relationship with violence and celebrity. This led to scholarly examination of why certain criminals capture public attention and the potential dangers of glorifying criminal behavior. The coverage of Ted's case also helped educate the public about personal safety and the tactics used by predatory criminals. His methods of approaching victims by feigning injury or authority became widely known, potentially helping other women avoid similar situations. Educational and training impact. Ted's case became a standard study in law enforcement training programs, criminal justice education, and forensic psychology courses. The detailed documentation of his crimes, investigative challenges, and ultimate capture provided educational material that helped train new generations of law enforcement professionals. Robert Keppel's documentation of his interactions with Ted and the lessons learned from the investigation became foundational texts in criminal investigation training. His work demonstrated how persistence, attention to detail, and innovative thinking could eventually overcome even sophisticated criminal behavior. The case also influenced academic research in criminology and psychology, generating numerous studies and publications that advanced understanding of serial crime and criminal behavior. Universities began offering specialized courses in criminal profiling and serial crime investigation, partly as a result of interest generated by Ted's case. Technological and investigative evolution. The challenges faced in investigating Ted's crimes contributed to the adoption of computer technology in law enforcement. Detective Keppel's use of early computer systems to analyze thousands of potential suspects demonstrated the value of technology in managing large-scale investigations. The recognition that serial killers like Ted often had extensive geographic ranges of operation influenced the development of mapping software and analytical tools that could help investigators identify patterns across large areas. These tools became standard equipment in major investigations and contributed to more effective resource allocation. Long-term institutional changes. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which later became the Behavioral Analysis Unit, was significantly influenced by the lessons learned from Ted's case. The unit's approach to criminal profiling, offender interviews, and investigative support was shaped by the insights gained from studying Ted and other serial killers of his era. Law enforcement agencies across the country modified their training programs to include education about serial crime recognition and investigation techniques developed through cases like Ted's. This standardization of knowledge helped ensure that similar crimes would be recognized and investigated more effectively in the future. Contemporary relevance: more than 3 decades after Ted's execution, his case continues to influence law enforcement and criminal justice. Cold case investigations frequently reference techniques and insights developed through his case, and his psychological profile remains a comparative standard for understanding other serial offenders. The ethical questions raised by Ted's media coverage and public fascination continue to be relevant as new high-profile criminal cases emerge. The balance between public interest, victim privacy, and the potential for glorifying criminal behavior remains an ongoing challenge in the digital age. Ted Bundy's legacy is ultimately one of transformation. His crimes were horrific and caused immeasurable pain, but the response to those crimes fundamentally improved how society investigates, understands, and prevents similar violence. The systems, techniques, and knowledge developed in response to his case have undoubtedly saved lives by helping law enforcement more effectively identify and apprehend other dangerous criminals. In this way, some measure of meaning has been extracted from the tragedy of his crimes, ensuring that the victims who died were not forgotten and that their deaths contributed to protecting future potential victims. Conclusion: the story of Ted Bundy represents one of the most complex and significant criminal cases in American history, spanning over a decade of investigation, legal proceedings, and ultimately, justice. From his troubled childhood in Vermont to his execution in Florida, Ted's life illustrates the development of a sophisticated criminal mind and the extraordinary efforts required to bring such an individual to account for his crimes. Ted's case fundamentally changed how America understands and investigates serial crime. His intelligence, charm, and ability to blend into society challenged existing stereotypes about criminals and demonstrated that evil could hide behind a facade of normalcy and respectability. The techniques developed to investigate his crimes, the psychological insights gained from studying his behavior, and the institutional changes implemented in response to his case continue to influence law enforcement and criminal justice today. The victims of Ted Bundy, at least 30 confirmed, but potentially many more, were young women with their entire lives ahead of them. They were students, daughters, and individuals with dreams and aspirations that were brutally cut short. While Ted's story has become a subject of fascination, it is crucial to remember that at its core, this is a story about the loss of innocent life and the devastating impact of violence on families and communities. The investigation and prosecution of Ted Bundy involved hundreds of law enforcement professionals, legal experts, and other professionals who dedicated years of their lives to ensuring that justice was served. Their persistence, innovation, and refusal to be manipulated by Ted's psychological games ultimately prevailed, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminals can be held accountable for their actions. Ted's execution on January 24, 1989, marked the end of a criminal career that had terrorized multiple states and captivated national attention. However, his impact on American culture, law enforcement, and criminal justice continues to resonate today. His case serves as both a cautionary tale about the potential for evil that can exist in seemingly normal individuals and an example of how society can adapt and improve its systems in response to new challenges. The entire story of Ted Bundy is ultimately a testament to the triumph of justice over manipulation, of persistence over deception, and of society's ability to protect itself from those who would prey upon the innocent. While his crimes can never be undone and his victims can never be restored to their families, the lessons learned from his case continue to serve the cause of justice and